It was very early on in their relationship when Harry is bowled over by Meghan, is desperately in love.
What she allowed it to become, which I think was unforgivable, was a tirade against the racist royal family.
The question really is whether Harry realizes himself how he has completely cut himself off, and whether, if something goes wrong in his own marriage.
The world witnessed the unfolding of a fantastic tale, an elegant, historical, and internationally acclaimed royal wedding. However, a different narrative was subtly developing beneath the polished smiles and well-timed moments. According to renowned investigator Tom Bower, the reality was much more complicated than anyone could have predicted. Few could see the tensions, deliberate maneuvers, and fractures beneath the spectacle. But what if the most well-known royal union of our day wasn't at all what it appeared to be? His next revelation not only casts doubt on the story, but it completely transforms it. Now take a closer look. What secret detail do you believe the world has totally missed? Why is it more important than we were informed? Post your opinions in the comments section. As we reveal what was never supposed to be seen, subscribe now. Quiet doubt casts a shade on the revelry. Everything looked perfect from the outside. As Meghan Markle and Prince Harry prepared for what was being referred to as a once-in-a-generation royal wedding, the entire world watched. Everything about it held the weight of a contemporary fairy tale: the location, the suspense, the worldwide interest. Each picture conveyed the same message of harmony, enthusiasm, and a bright future. However, beneath that polished exterior, something much less obvious was starting to take shape. Long before the vows were exchanged, there were already subdued worries circulating among royal circles, according to stories later examined by Tom Bower. These weren't statements made in public. There were no spectacular confrontations or formal warnings. Rather, there was a developing uneasiness that was controlled, discreet, and mostly unspoken. Over time, those closest to the institution had witnessed enough to identify trends. Furthermore, the image that was being portrayed to the world did not fully match what they were seeing. The alarm wasn't set off in a single instance. It was the result of lesser signals building up, choices that seemed a little out of pace with royal custom, interactions that had an edge that was hard to ignore even though they weren't overtly destructive, things that linger in private conversations but do not make headlines. Questions started to emerge in certain areas, not loud inquiries or accusations, but careful considerations of the potential long-term consequences of this marriage. Concurrently, the public narrative shifted in the other direction. Romance, transformation, and the prospect of a new era for the monarchy dominated headlines. A subtle tension was produced by the difference between what was perceived in public and what was experienced in private. On a worldwide scale, one version of the tale was being honored. Behind the royal walls, another was being carefully examined. The timing of this moment was what made it so important. After the wedding, these worries did not surface. Shaped in retrospect or impacted by subsequent occurrences, they existed prior to the ceremony, the sealing of the commitments, and the formalization of everything. The perspective is changed just by that detail. It implies that those carefully observing from within could not have been totally surprised by what transpired afterward. Nevertheless, millions of viewers were unable to see any of this. Wrapped in tradition and accuracy, the show proceeded without a doubt. The world continued to see it as flawless, whole, and certain. However, there was a reason for that silent doubt. It had been developing piece by piece, molded by seemingly insignificant occurrences that turned out to be significant. Beneath perfect ceremony and widespread praise, quietly, something much less ideal was taking place. Fragments of a bigger story were hidden in every polished moment. Why were little fissures appearing long before anyone noticed if everything appeared so certain? And to what truth were they all heading? Let's discover the truth. An encounter that might not have been possible. It wasn't just a calm uncertainty. Long before the engagement, long before the headlines, and long before the world was invited to see the story unfold, it had a deeper connection. The relationship's beginnings itself start to take on a distinct tone as focus moves backward. They seem less serendipitous, and more intentional. Tom Bower claims that Meghan Markle's journey into Prince Harry's realm was not as impulsive as it was frequently portrayed. Interviewees regarded the relationship as effortless and natural. A straightforward introduction, a blind date, or two people meeting without any expectations. However, Bower's story offers an alternative viewpoint that is molded by planning and purpose rather than accident. He implies that Meghan had already been steadily advancing into more powerful social circles in the years preceding that initial encounter. This was hardly an abrupt change. It was deliberate and slow. After her first marriage ended in divorce in 2013, she seemed to take a different path. Her surroundings started to show a different kind of ambition, one that was more in line with wealth, prestige, and international recognition. She seemed to be getting closer to a world where relationships were just as important as opportunities with each step. The introduction to Prince Harry becomes even more important in that scenario. According to Bower, Meghan had already spent some time getting to know Harry before their initial meeting in London. Not just the public personality, but the individual behind the persona, his passions, his principles, and the causes that were important to him. Africa, humanitarian efforts, and conservation. These details weren't arbitrary. According to Bower, they were closely examined because they were essential to his identity. An uncomfortable question is raised by that degree of preparedness. Was this an accidental encounter, or was it the product of strategic placement? The suggestion alone starts to change how the story is perceived, even when the response is not given as reality. It raises the idea that behind-the-scenes intent may have driven what seemed effortless. The way everything seemed to come together organically later is what made this even more fascinating. The links seemed to happen instantly. There is no denying the chemistry. It appeared genuine and almost inevitable from the outside. However, it is more difficult to accept that narrative simplicity without challenge when it is considered in the context of earlier movement, study, and timing. As their bond grew with startling speed and certainty, everything appeared effortless, even predestined. However, one question remains when timing, preparation, and accuracy are compared side by side. Was this really fate playing out, or something much more intentional currently underway? Remain with us. A relationship that grew stronger at a remarkable rate. Then, as soon as they were together, things started to happen pretty quickly. What had begun as a brief introduction in London swiftly developed into something much more intense and all-consuming. It appeared to be a strong and instantaneous connection to onlookers. Without hesitation, two people find certainty in one another. Beneath that exterior, however, the pace itself started to pose subtle problems. According to Tom Bower, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's romance did not go the methodical route that is frequently anticipated in royal life. Rather, it quickened. Emotions immediately became more intense. Decisions trailed closely behind. Harry seemed fully committed in a short amount of time, not just emotionally, but also mentally and personally. He was candid about how certain he was and how fast he thought he had met the person he had been looking for. That degree of assurance at such a young age turned into a defining characteristic of the partnership. It added a sense of intensity to the story that was hard to ignore. Bower draws attention to what has been called love bombing, a word used to characterize a pattern in which excessive quantities of affection, attention, and emotional connection are shown during the start of a relationship. It forges a strong connection that can feel real and indisputable, but it also happens extremely fast. In this case, that rapid emotional build seemed to draw Harry in completely. His responses reflected deep attachment formed in a relatively short time. His whole life revolved around the relationship. Early on, plans were discussed. Almost instantly, the future was envisioned. From the outside, it appeared to be a contemporary love tale unfolding at its own speed. However, that pace was unusual in royal circles, where tradition and caution frequently dictate choices. Additionally, there were hints of urgency, not pressure in the overt sense, but a continuous shift toward commitment with little opportunity for hesitation. Discussions about timetables, life decisions, and the future seemed to start earlier than anticipated. There was no ambiguity in the relationship. It proceeded with intention. The way this moment relates to everything that has come before makes it even more important. The planning, the placement, and the comprehension of Harry as a person. Even though it is not publicly acknowledged, these components come together to provide a picture that feels meticulously coordinated. For the general audience, it continued to be a tale of love developing organically. Upon closer inspection, it took on a more complex appearance that compelled a second glance, not because of what was immediately apparent, but rather because of how swiftly everything came together. However, the relationship's speed was not the only thing that changed. It was the events that started to take place around it and the person Harry was growing into within it. What if the widely accepted love tale was really the outward manifestation of something far more deliberate, where each moment was too perfectly timed to be a coincidence? And why did everything around Harry start to subtly shift in ways that few could comprehend as the romance became stronger? The silent distance that made all the difference. However, the relationship's speed was not the only thing that changed. It was the thing that started to change around it. The area surrounding Prince Harry began to change gradually at first, then more clearly. The folks who had known him long before the spotlight became more intense, and who had been a part of his life for years started to disappear. Accounts that Tom Bower looked into indicate that this was not an abrupt break. It was a slow, subtle shift that doesn't immediately become apparent, but once it takes hold, is hard to ignore. A reported incident from a 2017 Sandringham shooting weekend was at the heart of this change. What was supposed to be a comfortable get-together of close friends turned into something completely different. Conversations apparently became tense during that weekend. Subjects that were previously dismissed started to gain significance. Jokes and remarks were no longer accepted in the same manner, particularly when they touched on delicate social topics. It was reported that Meghan Markle actively refuted certain comments, creating a different atmosphere than Harry's pals were accustomed to. It was more than just a disagreement. It was a change in tone that made the atmosphere seem more guarded and less laid back. What came next was much more important. Reports say that weekend was a watershed. Harry's relationship with several members of his close group started to wane. Individuals who had been a constant in his life were now less prevalent. The invitations were modified. The pace of communication slowed. The relationship deteriorated in ways that were more obvious with time, yet it did not completely vanish. As the wedding drew near, the effects of that change were apparent. A distinct story emerged from events that ought to have involved lifelong friends. At important events, such as the private dinner following the wedding, several of Harry's closest friends and family members were conspicuously absent. There was notification of their absence. This shift felt important to many who are experienced with royal history, where devotion and enduring connections frequently have profound significance. New faces started to emerge in their place. Harry's social circle was changing as a result of new objectives and influences. Some saw it as a normal shift into a new stage of life. Others wondered what had been left behind and why. This moment is especially remarkable since it happened so quietly. There were no official acknowledgements of the changes, nor were there any public declarations outlining the distance. However, the impact was genuine and changed Harry's surroundings in a way that would last long beyond the wedding. And as those well-known faces moved aside, the guest list's makeup started to show something even more surprising. And just like that, the perfect royal love story begins to look very different. What the world celebrated as a fairy tale may have been something far more layered, far more calculated, and far more complex than anyone realized. Because when you look beyond the headlines, beyond the smiles, beyond the carefully crafted image, you start to see the cracks that were there from the very beginning. So the real question is, was this truly love unfolding naturally, or a story that was always being guided behind the scenes? And if those early signs were real, then what else has the world been missing all along? Backhand index pointing right. If you made it this far, hit subscribe right now, because what comes next might completely change how you see this story. Thumbs up like this video if you believe there's more behind royal headlines than we're ever told, and drop your opinion below. Was it fate or was it planned? Because one thing is certain, this story isn't over yet. And the truth, it's only just beginning to surface.